You know, that's just the way it is. So the model is the same. So how does UCT then decide that its value should be that much higher? It's very difficult to understand these numbers. And the vice chancellors aren't in the habit of explaining where these numbers came from. The reality behind these numbers is that for a very long time, every year, they would simply increase it by a particular number. And since no one stood up and said, please explain where this number came from, they kept doing it. So this is how we ended up with these particular systems, okay? In order to understand, just how unreal these numbers are, if you compare a couple of universities, and you say, okay, UJ and the University of Limpopo are the same size. If they're the same size, the inputs are the same, so therefore the cost must be the same. What explains the differences is that people simply look at the students that walk in and say, she looks like she can afford it, let's hike prices. If it's black and it doesn't look like it, give him a loan. So that's been the way the system has been designed. So they still can't explain how their numbers are so different, and they simply say it's the way it is. It isn't the way it should be, okay? This is the most disturbing of all documents that you're going to find, because guess who came up with it? The people that hardly ever come up with anything, NSFAS, have come up with these numbers. So the question was raised to NSFAS, how did you guys work out that you must give 67,000 rand to students? And then they said, okay, what we did is that we went to the different universities and we asked them to give us how much it costs to accommodate a student. UCT has moved from 37,000 to 113,000 in a 12-year period. This is apparently the world record for inflation. Nothing else has increased at that value, anywhere else in the world. Okay? So, very interesting how Max Price does his numbers. Victoria, 100,000 rand, Wits, and all of that. Now, if you look at the list of the universities here, it covers some of them. The point is, if a student goes to any of those universities, and that student is told, because you're black, you must be on NSFAS, they actually can't afford it. And look at what it looks like. So NSFAS is happy to concede that they're actually underfunding students across the board. And the only people that actually can say NSFAS makes sense to us are the students at CUT and TUT. Those are the only two that can say it. So whenever somebody says that NSFAS is the answer, you have to ask them, it's an answer for who exactly? Because clearly, this is not the answer that it should be, okay? If they were funding students properly, then they wouldn't say the answer is 67. The answer would be how much does it cost to have you at a particular institution, and that's what they would do. Yeah. But they don't do it, okay? Instead, what they hope to do is that if you don't end up squatting, there's a loan shark somewhere in your neighborhood, you'll get a loan from them. So by the time you graduate, you not only own NSFAS, but your mother has had to give up, you know, all her Tupperware in order to get the loan sharks to give her more money. So NSFAS, it is immoral to defend the position of NSFAS. It is completely difficult to reconcile the facts. The question is, are we simply asking the government to spend money that it doesn't have? And people always like to compare countries. So if we look at all these countries that the president always likes hanging out with, you know, he's always in the arms of China, Brazil, Russia, India. So we've actually taken his own friends and say, look at what your friends are doing with their own education systems. So we only spend 0.7% of our GDP on higher education. Cuba spends 4.5%, but I can guarantee you no one in here wants to live in Cuba, okay? Because in Cuba, it's a perfectly socialist system, and the reality is that professors earn less than cleaners in Cuba simply because it's a socialist system. So since they can't sell their services elsewhere, the system is wholly owned by the state, there is no premium associated with their services, so they're as poor as cleaners are. So nobody wants to go to Cuba. A good example of what we're trying to implement is Brazil. Because Brazil actually has free university education. It has about 27 federal universities, okay? And a lot of private universities. So Brazil has it. The problem that we encounter, and the minister is very happy to use Brazil as an example. The problem that we encounter is that in Brazil, ironically, all the poor students go to private universities, they don't go to free universities. The reason behind that is that as soon as the universities noticed that everybody could get access, they simply then made the entrance criteria 90% and above. So naturally, it's only people who went to private schools in high school that score 90% and get into the university system. So then all the poor students end up with, private universities in which they have to pay. It's a great irony. We are better than Brazil, because Brazil has 26 universities, they have a population of 200 million. We have 76 institutions of higher learning, which is 26 universities and 50 FET colleges, and we only have a population of 50 million. So when people say that Brazil did it and they failed, that's because Brazil was incompetent. It's not because we can't do it, okay? Another important thing to note about Brazil is that Brazil obviously doesn't know how to screen its own population, okay? South Africa has a very unique way of dealing with our population. So we are happy to then say that because in South Africa we've got 5 categories of schools, quintile 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we will then advocate to say that since the poor are defined as students who go to quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools, then we'll have spaces allocated to them, so then they'll be guaranteed access into the system, provided they meet the academic merit within that pool, and then the other people will compete on an open field. UCT already does this. It's very unpopular. So they've got 2 different entry criteria. The Vets Medical School does the same thing, and the UK Medical School does the same thing. So if you meet Blade on the corridor, please tell him that Brazil is not the answer. I will debate him off the ground if he thinks Brazil is the solution. What happened in 2016 is that it was on this day, well, yesterday, last year, where we marched to the union buildings. Some of us were tear gassed. I still remember what tear gas smells like, thanks to the ANC. And got a 0% increase. Okay? And our understanding was that these people would then go into a room and then find a way of mapping out how to roll out free education. It was then remarkably disturbing to discover last month that they still don't have an answer. So you think with all the people they have at their disposal, they will come with an answer, but they didn't. Okay? What they did, unfortunately, was that the president and the minister aren't actually the best of friends. Because what the president did was that he decided to come up with a commission of inquiry. If the president and the minister had been friends, he would have asked the minister, have you done this work before? And the answer would have been yes, I've done the work before. And the answer was that you must implement free education. That answer was back in 2012. So if the president had spoken to his own minister, we wouldn't have this commission that's trying to address the question that was answered 4 years ago. Okay? That document is available for anyone who wants to read it. It's only 101 pages long, so I think you can go through it during generations. Okay? So this commission is unfortunately asking the wrong question because it's saying should we do it instead of when should we do it. So we've had a lot of questions over the past couple of weeks that say why don't you go and present to the Fees Commission? The only thing that students could ever present to the Fees Commission is they need to print out that 101-page report and go to the commission and say, here's the answer to your question. Why are you still here? That is really what the role of students should be in relation to that particular commission. The damages have been calculated at 600 million rand. So again, the minister is very happy to tell us what the bill from the damages is, but it doesn't tell us what the cost of excluding poor students from university education is. So we all do the numbers that make us look good. That's his problem. What he also did, unfortunately, completely incorrectly, is that he came back in September and then he said the answer is 8%. How? Minister, how can the answer be 8%? What question are you addressing? Okay? So maybe it's because, not everybody has TV, so they can't see what's on the ground. But the question last year was, when are fees falling? Firstly, he assumed that fees were meant to be frozen. That was his first mistake. The second one is that he thought that the fees must fall campaign was a 2015 problem. So in 2017, he can allow universities to raise fees again. He got it completely wrong. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the minister has then decided that apartheid was right after all. Because the minister is now engaged in the habit of saying that students must parade their poverty before we can decide whether they should be funded or not. So the idea that you must all then go and explain how poor you are in order to be declared as a valid human being in the system is deeply offensive to a lot of us. Okay? So the reason the students could not take the minister's recommendations as a progressive step is that it was actually regressive. Last year, 0% was rolled across the board. This year, 8% is done to a specific population. So clearly, it is regressive in nature. What the minister did is exactly this. So he might have, I don't know if he did, called upon Adam Habib and said, what are your fees? And the answer would have been 101,000 Rand. So what the minister has done is that he said, you can increase them to 109,000 Rand, and then you must send me the bill for 8,000 Rand, and then send the student the bill for 101,000 Rand. How does this address the core question of when are fees falling? Okay? So if you received a fee statement of 101,000 Rand in 2015, the minister has decided that you'll get the same statement next year. Whether you think that amounts to fees falling, I'm not too sure. I don't personally see it as fees falling. So this is the problem with the 8% conversation. Another interesting thing about this 8% conversation is that, again, the minister forgot to call the finance minister before he made the announcement. Because when people asked him, okay, so you've decided that the definition of the poor and the missing middle is 600,000 Rand. Okay, that's what he said. So up to 600,000 Rand, that defines who's poor and who's middle class. Above that, those people are rich and they must pay for their own way. There's one problem with that statistic. The reality is that we then called SARS a couple of days later and said, so how many people are in that bracket? And SARS had the answer that says there are exactly 566,000 taxpayers who earn more than 500,000 Rand. In other words, it is 1% of the population. So then we went back and then we said, wait a minute. The minister is actually saying that he's willing to cover the fees for 99% of the population. We may as well say 100%, minister, because that's really what he's offering. So he didn't even do his own research to actually understand that the impact of the 8% statement simply means that he's covering 99% of the student population, of South Africa's population, and saying 1% must pay for themselves. That's one part of the conversation. The second part is a more difficult one, because he then came back and said, well, actually, that 600,000 seated, okay, those people represent 1% of the population, but they account for 30% of the spaces in the university system. And we said, that is exactly the point. How can a public institution reserve 30% of the places to 1% of the population simply because they're buying their way to the system? That is the issue here. So the rest of us, who make up 99% of the population, are only allocated 70% of the spaces. That is the definition of inequality. So we are not introducing inequality into the debate, it's already built into it. And that is the consequence of what the minister has done. Okay? What we then say is that you've spent a year completely unable to come up with a solution. How about we try and give you a template? So we're not saying that this is the absolute solution. We're saying that this is how you formulate the conversation. Okay? The first thing that the minister does very well is that he's an Olympian. He engages in the Olympics of legitimacy. In the Olympics of legitimacy, he decides who's legitimate, whose voice must be heard, and those are the people that he listens to. The legitimacy of this movement is from the grassroots, because it started from the grassroots. It is difficult for us to understand how he then decides that he's going to appoint a task team in secret that does not involve students, and they must come up with that solution. Those were the task teams that gave him this incorrect advice of saying, you must go and tell the students 8% and they will love you. This is the consequence of deciding that some people's voices are more legitimate than others. In that process of delegitimization, he's demonizing the student movement when they're the ones that actually highlighted the problem. This is the consequence of his actions. It is difficult to feel sorry for him. So the first thing that we're asking the state to do is to then say, well, 15 years ago, when the system was full of white students, you were happy to pay 50% of the cost. Do it again. One more time. That's all we're asking for. Okay? So if the state restores its subsidy to 50% of the cost, it means that at the individual student level, the fees must fall. That is step number one. Okay? The second question is that we say, you must actually then go and find out why the system is so expensive to maintain. So if you are telling us that the system costs 60 billion Rand per year to run, what makes up that 60 billion? And if you look at it closely, it then appears that about 10 billion Rand is actually made up of just infrastructure issues. So you've got the buildings, that's the infrastructure component, then you've got the human capital, which are the lecturers, and then you've got the resources, which is everything that you need. So we are of the opinion that the minister should then be able to go to his friends in the JSE and say, guys, I need 10 billion rand, okay? If the minister can get the 10 billion rand buy-in, it will mean that he is no longer the one that has to pay for the building of a lecture theatre or of a laboratory. But what will happen is that corporate South Africa will fund that process, and then he must then find a way to pay them back in the future. It's not our problem how he does it. So if you create that infrastructure fund, it means that the cost of running the system have declined. And if the cost of running the system has declined, it means that the cost per student has been lowered. And this is how fees will fall. Okay. So then we gave them a whole lot of ideas to say, actually, this is how you must frame the conversation. So you can go to corporate South Africa and say, these are the issues I'm trying to fix, please help me out. So the information is available because we didn't want to run the risk of the minister saying, I need to go and do research, because then that takes us 3 more months for him to come up with the wrong answer. Okay? So we gave him the strike and said, this is what it looks like. So this is the example that we put out there to say, okay, this is what it looks like for an individual student. Currently, if a student is being charged 80,000 rand, this is where it comes from. Okay? So the universities work out that they need 60 billion, the government gives them 24 billion rand, companies give them 18 billion, and then they say to students, give us 18 billion rand, knowing very well that the students cannot afford it. So that's how they then say 30,000 rand is what's going to be on your fee statement. So if he can go and convince his friends in corporate South Africa to give him this infrastructure fund, it will mean that student fees can decline by 56% per student. Okay? And that is even before he goes and speaks to his boss and says, we have a problem with this 50% subsidy. So if he then goes back to his boss and say, okay, corporate South Africa doesn't want to listen to me, at least you can give me the 50% so I can provide back to universities. So if that's all he did, he would be able to decrease fees by 50% per student. If he managed to convince his own boss and corporate South Africa to actually play their part in funding the system, then individual, university, student fees would decline by 89%. All he has to do is pick up the phone, but the minister refuses to listen. Okay? So this is what we show to the state to say, this is actually how you address the question of how fees must fall. The third step was to then say, okay, now that fees have fallen for the students, how do we then ensure that those students who obviously cannot afford it, whatever the number is, are then funded through the system? Okay? So what we then did was that we said, you know what? The problem in society right now is that everybody thinks that students just want free education and they don't care who pays for it. Of course we care who pays for it, because being a student is not a permanent occupation. We will eventually become graduates, we will eventually become, old people like everybody else. So we need to be able to explain to you that we understand the sensitivities around these particular issues, okay? So what we are asking for is the creation of a self-sustaining education fund, okay? An education fund that sustains itself simply means that no student will ever be left out of the system because they cannot afford it, okay? What we want this fund to look like is that it's something similar to a pension fund. Pension funds don't go bankrupt in South Africa because they find a way to subsidize themselves. They're very beautiful structures, okay? So if you look at how a pension fund is structured, what a pension fund does is that it collects funding from its members, okay? So that's the income source, and then it spends on the members that retire. So it's a permanently solvent equation. The problem that South Africa has done is that for a very long time, they've assumed that students want to be a cost to the system. And we're saying that students don't want to be a cost to the system. Students want to be seen as an investment, okay? So if you regard students as an investment, this is how you must actually deal with this problem. The problem is this: when a person arrives here on day one, straight after matric, their offered ability to pay is completely determined by circumstances that they cannot control. A student cannot control that all he has as a guardian is a grandparent who earns 400 rand a month. You can't control that. A student cannot control that their parents died because someone decided that shooting another person's parents is the way to do. So if students are not in control of those particular circumstances, it is completely unfair and borderline immoral to then use my unfortunate circumstances to evaluate whether I should participate in education or not. Yeah. So it's a morality question. Okay? So we are saying that you need to move this payment conversation away from people who are not in control of their own circumstances and shift it elsewhere. That is our thinking. Okay? So if we create this particular fund, we will take a step back and say, okay, how much do we need in order to fund students that enter the system? And whatever that answer is, we then say, this is where you can find the money. Okay? So these are the sources of the funding that we've identified. And all of them can be done as soon as the government decides that they want to actually fix that 1% is expired. So if they just move it by 1%, 1% only, that's 14 billion rand towards the funding of students. If the corporates increase their taxes by just 2%, no, 2% is a small number, unless you're on 47%, okay, or 48%. In the past months, then it's a different 1% is a money. Okay? So if they increase it by 2%, then we're getting 13 billion rand into the system. If you increase taxes on the wealthy, you can get another 5 billion. And if somebody wakes up and says, all the people that stole money during apartheid, can we send them invoices like we send to national students? Yeah. The answer will be 6 billion. So these are the different avenues that we've said need to be explored in order to be able to say, actually, this is how we can fund this process. So funding is not the problem. It's the commitment and the willingness that's missing. Because no one has then come back and said, no, it's completely illegal or completely immoral to talk about the skills levy. They all agree that it can be done. And all you need to do is go to Chapter 4 of the Skills Development Levies Act, and you actually need to change, I think it's the 4th and the 5th words, that give the Minister of Labour the directive, the discretion to change the number. Simply tell them, from 1% mill rate, it must be 2%. It's that easy. But they don't want to do it. When it comes to corporate taxes, it is Section 5 of the Income Tax Act. And all you have to do is change one number from 28 to 30. Nothing else needs to be done. And this is how we can facilitate it. So these are all the avenues that have been made available to the state in order for it to fix what is becoming, well, long became actually a national crisis, but they're not willing to do that. Okay? So our philosophy is very clear, that you must advocate for universal funding for all undergraduate students. Another key component of this is that people are like, no, the rich must pay for themselves, and then everyone else must be funded. There are particular problems associated with that. And you must be aware, in this Olympics of legitimacy, some voices are unheard. If you go to the University of Venda, which is about 6 hours away, and then you bring everyone into one room and say, the minister thinks that everybody on 600,000 rand is rich. Please raise your hands if you are rich. Not a single person would raise their hands. If you go to the University of Cape Town, you get a completely different answer. So the problem with the system that says the rich must pay their own way and then the poor must go to the University of Venda is that we are now creating two separate classes within the system. So we're creating a new form of inequality because all the rich people will then decide to go to UCT. UCT will then say, oh, we're full, all the poor must go to Venda. Okay? So as soon as you create that distinction between the rich and the poor, okay, what then happens is that the poor university thinks of itself as poor, and then they start delivering their product in a very poor and stigmatized way. And we don't want that. We're not creating a different class of society. We are saying that these spaces need to be integrated with people from different backgrounds, and we found a way to ensure that this happens. So this is why the fundamental call should be that everybody should be funded. You must have seen it before. The idea that you can sit next to someone who says, oh, I paid for this way, and you got in through a system or through the taxes that my mother paid. It creates tensions between two students. And those are the tensions that you see when you walk in and you try to lecture, and a person can easily say, but I pay your salary. Only the people who actually think that they're rich and are paying into the system have the audacity to say such things. No black student has ever said this to me, but a few white students have. It's remarkably offensive. Okay? So we're trying to get away from all those class contradictions. Okay? The rollout of this funding is obviously immediate priority are the students who quite clearly cannot afford it. So those that we regard, because if I walk up to you and say, you are poor, it's not the nicest thing that anyone's ever said to you. So we fail to understand why the state is creating a system where some people get labeled on the basis of the circumstances that they didn't create themselves. It is wrong, but that's what we're stuck with as a country. So what we want is that we are moving away from a loan system, and a subsidy simply means that if you've qualified, you've met the academic entrance criteria, and you can't afford it, we'll fund you. So it's a subsidy exercise. When you graduate, the only piece of paper a person is supposed to receive on the steps of grade 4 is a graduation certificate, not a loan statement. We don't want those at all, okay? So the government had, the last time they actually had this conversation was in 1997, and the guy that had the conversation was the Minister of Education, Professor Khaya. So for a long time, I actually thought he was dead. I discovered last week that he's still alive. So we're trying to figure out why he's silent about this. Because now they're blaming him for having come up with NSFAS. I'm like, no. What Professor Bengu did, and I think this is in paragraph 42 to pay, okay? So that's a starting point. Now, Minister Blade has come up with 600,000 rand. That number is completely wrong, but we're willing to go with it because, well, that's what is offered us. We're not going to turn it down, okay? So what we want to do differently is that instead of giving black students a loan statement when they leave university, we want to be able to say to everyone who's gone through a university system that you are a beneficiary of this subsidized system. You need to contribute towards the future of the people that come into the system afterwards. So that is the social compact that we're talking about, okay? So our starting point is that you must ensure that you can fund everyone within the system. But currently, they don't have the money because they've spent it on that castle in Ghana. Let it go, guys. The castle is there in Ghana. We need to deal with what we have here, okay? So what we've done is that we've presented two options. These are interim options. Please be aware of that. These are the options of how you roll it out in the short term before you actually achieve the goal of universal free education. Okay? So in the interim, you've got this one option. And in this particular option, we've then gone back to Professor Bengu's statement and said, okay, we need to talk about an ability to pay. Okay? If a family earns less than 300,000 rand, they simply cannot afford vet fees. They simply cannot. Okay? So that family is not expected to make any contribution towards the system. Okay? Which means that the state is fully responsible for funding that particular student. The one thing that I mentioned earlier on is that we group our schools into different categories. Okay? Now, quintile 1 to 3 schools, yet another element of the immorality of this government, because these are the schools that they are willing to let decay. So they're the poorest schools and the state is happy to leave them there. So what happens is that people that come from those schools aren't given the right support, academic support, to prepare them for university. So we are saying that actually you cannot then turn around and say, oh, but these people don't pass anyway, because you created a system that didn't allow them to pass. Yeah. So you will pay if that person needs an additional year, because you've created a basic education system that screwed over this person's readiness anyway. Okay? So this is what we're asking for, is regulation time plus an additional year. There are some people who are fortunate in that they might have received a scholarship to go to a very good school, but they're still from a very poor family. So if you manage to receive a scholarship to go to Parktown or St. John's, whatever the case might be, then obviously we expect you to be out of the system within regulation time. So we'll fund you for that particular point. And for us, we are moving away from a conversation that simply says, all poor people are never going to pass, to saying, actually, all people who went to particular schools have this chance of succeeding, and these people have a different chance of succeeding. So we're looking more into the reality of what happens out there, instead of simply deciding who's poor and who isn't, and just designing an answer based on that. So the third group of students are people who have an ability to pay, okay? Now this ability to pay is then very different in our modeling, because what we are saying here is that if a family has 300,000 rand as income, and they have one student within the system, okay, and you force them to pay, when that family introduces a second child into the system, they don't double their income overnight, okay? So we are saying that the way black families have been structured is that a lot of them have the extended family setup. So when we say that a family must contribute, we need to be able to say to this family, this is your contribution to the system, and then the state will cover the rest. Because now we need to move away from the question of, what if I happen to have twins? Okay? Does it mean my income has doubled? We know it hasn't. So therefore, we need to be we need to be very clear in that we understand the nature of our family structures. Okay? So even at this level, this family is contributing only 37,500 Rand in total, which means it's only 8% of their income that actually comes into the system. That's the ability to pay. And then the state must cover the rest. For families that are in the fourth bracket, the 450,000 Rand bracket, again, we are saying to them, their ability to pay is a bit better than the first three groups. So we are saying to them, actually, the maximum we can expect out of you is simply 14% of that family's income coming into the system. And we think this is a more equitable way that actually deals with the reality that you can't decide that everybody above 600,000 is rich and everybody below 600,000 is poor, because that is unequal in itself. In that design, it makes no sense. So we've given them the data that actually says, this is how you explain it in a way that actually makes sense to families out there. So next time, when somebody says, I've got a child in matric, this is my income, what do I need to pay next year? I need to be able to give them a concrete answer, and then the state is responsible for the rest. Currently, it's simply a lottery system that no one understands. Okay? Alternatively, we might have a system where the government does the opposite. Okay? So the government can decide that you tell us how much you earn, and then we'll pay an amount into the system on your behalf, linked to how much you earn, and then thereafter you cover the rest. Okay? So if a family has an income of 400,000, the government will simply say, okay, at 400,000, we're going to pay. Wow. Anyway, that was something. We're going to pay 15% on your behalf, and then you cover the rest. Again, this is the system that looks into the question of what a person can afford themselves, and then says, this is how we're going to help you out. In whichever model we choose, the people that are below 300,000 Rand should not even be asked the question. Their education must be paid for. Okay? So we then say, okay, fine. The questions that people have been asking is, why we're accommodating the rich? Isn't basic education more important, and all of these things? And we address all of these questions because we're saying, firstly, when you say education as a public good, you are lying. Okay? It is a crucial and a very important public good, so you must not undermine its status. What education does is that it enables people to participate in the economy, and that was the spirit of the Freedom Charter that Gwede seems to have forgotten. Okay? So when the Freedom Charter spoke about basic education, it was on the understanding that when a person has a matric certificate, then they will be able to participate in the economy. Unfortunately, 40 years or 50 years down the line, when Angie took over the basic education system, she made the matric certificate a completely irrelevant piece of paper. We have 3 million people who've passed matric who are sitting at home who can't get into the system. So clearly that piece of paper no longer facilitates this economic participation and the social mobility that the Freedom Charter was talking about. So this is now this is now the public good that the Freedom Charter was talking about, the university system. Okay? So what we are saying is that there are 3 chief beneficiaries in the system. It's the it's the graduates themselves, it's society at large, and it's the corporates that employ them. So those 3 people should be able to participate in funding the system. But what is important here is that we are not saying that free education should be just for students. It's actually free education for the state and society at large. Because our modeling simply says that when I just finished matric, you can't ask me about the payment question. But once I've graduated and I'm working, then we can have the conversation. So what we're doing is that we're saying it's not free education just for students, it's free education for South Africa. Because what the university students are going to do once they graduate is that they will then say, this is our contribution into the system so that another generation of students can be funded. So we're not actually asking for free education from everybody so that public hospitals go bankrupt. We are saying that we need your assistance in order to facilitate the creation of a model in which we actually pay for our own way into the system. We cannot do it as students, but later on, as employers and employees, we might have a different conversation. So it's a shifting of the conversation. And why it's important for us to shift this conversation is that there's been the demonization of the student movement across the country to say they want things for free. There's nothing for free here. We know it. We've understood the consequence of things not being free because some of us can't even get in. So we're now shifting the conversation to say, actually, we are willing to pay, but not at the level that that we can't afford it. So don't ask us when you're students. Ask us later on. Okay? So that's the way it should be. The problem with the question of whether the rich should pay for themselves is that, and Gwede said this a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately there were cameras, so I couldn't slap him. He said that the rich must pay for their own way because, if you say that you want them to be funded, it means that you're advocating for inequalities. And I said to him, the problem with that is that the rich can always exit the system. So I would rather go to the rich and say, I'm charging you an additional tax, which is earmarked for education, because it means that that person's contribution into the system will last longer than the number of children that they have in the system. And he refuses to understand this. He then takes his own son to China. And I'm like, but that's the problem I'm trying to highlight. Because the rich have the ability to decide what to do with their money, they can send their children to China instead of investing in South African education. But if we can say to them, actually your children are welcome to our system in exchange for a higher tax, it means we'll be collecting that higher tax for as long as they live, not for 3 or 4 years. Gwede doesn't get this. Okay? That's the first problem. The second problem is that, again, Gwede will say to you, the rich must pay their own fees. Now, Gwede and his friends are very good at lying through their teeth and not being aware. When they say that the rich must pay, and they put themselves up as templates to say, oh, I can pay my own way through UCT, it's because they know that they're paying a discounted fee from the money that's been taken from the poor. So the next time somebody says, no, I'm rich, I want to pay my own way, you must say to them, okay, actually, your invoice then needs to be changed. Every invoice that we give to people is now subsidized by taking money from poor students and then allocating it to everyone and then the rich benefit. We will now give you the true invoice, which excludes the subsidy. Now tell me if you can still afford it. And apparently the answer is not the same. Okay? So this is the issue here. They pay subsidized fees because the system doesn't distinguish. So rich people pay a discounted fee. When they graduate, they walk away with a degree certificate. You live with an NSFAS loan. Why? Okay? So these are the problems that we have here. So we are saying that we'll welcome everyone into the system in exchange for higher taxes because that raises more money. And it's not a matter of how many children you have, it's a matter of how much money that you have. And for us, that's the definition of what rich is. It's not children-based, it's money-based. Okay? Some people are saying that higher education is elitist because it only accommodates part of the population. Now, again, politicians like to be self-defeating because that argument is absolute rubbish. When people say that we are an unequal society, we're saying that's the problem we're trying to fix. We're an unequal society because the poor don't get given access to the same opportunities as the rich. So this is why we need to dismantle the system as well. So they'll tell you about the Gini coefficient and all of that. Then they'll say, if we fund higher education, it's only going to benefit a minority. And we say, no, it's only a minority because you exclude so many people anyway. So once you actually give people access, then you'll understand that this is not a system that's based on a minority. A lot of us want to be educated, but you're not giving us that opportunity. Okay? So we are not responsible for the inequalities in South African society. The current education system, which prioritizes the rich at the expense of the poor, is responsible for it. So why won't you allow us to fix it? Don't get it. Okay? So a lot of people will come to you and then they'll say, oh, but basic education is more important, and then health and all these things are more important. And then I say to them, well, the defense is not important, and yet you spend double the amount of money in defending yourselves against who? So we spend 1.2% of GDP in the military and only 0.7% in education. So all their arguments can actually be contested. And this is why they don't want to engage in a debate, because they know we've got the answers to everything that they can come up with. So they'll issue me the statements, and then you look at them and you're like, yo, this person done. Okay? We agree that basic education is a priority, but we're actually already spending about 2 to 5% of GDP on it, and they are mismanaging that system. We are not responsible for the mismanagement of basic education. Basic education doesn't need additional funding. It needs proper management as well. So when you're asking for funding, we're not redirecting it from basic education. And with that logic, it's a matter of, okay, fine. If we actually say to them, we're giving you money for basic education, it still will be dysfunctional. So they need to fix how they run basic education and not use that as a proxy to say we're advocating for the wrong thing. It is their responsibility after all, you know. So sometimes you get the impression that no, the students are stepping into a territory that they don't belong to. Whenever they ask these questions, I go, why don't you fix it? Okay? So you can't tell us that universities are not in crisis because you've decided to screw up basic education. That's not the way it works. It's not the Olympics of legitimacy we're engaging in. This is a crisis on its own. There are other crisis points out there, but this is also a crisis on its own. Okay? So we cannot delay fixing higher education systems. And then a lot of them are like, no, we're already being overtaxed. And then you're like, hey, actually, you know what? A lot of you who are earning that 41%, you went through this university system, you left the system, no one gave you a fee statement that says you actually owe society. We are simply saying it's time to pay back the money. Yes. Okay? That's all we're asking for. So we're even giving them an implementation guideline to say, this is how you roll it out. There are students within the system, and then there'll be new students that come into the system. So students within the system must now be evaluated under the new rules. So essentially, NSFAS still uses a completely pointless number of 150,000 Rand. We don't know what that means. So we are saying that evaluate everyone within the system so you understand who needs to be funded immediately. That's the first test. And then thereafter, you must then roll out the funding to everyone else within the system that needs it. It is your responsibility to work that out. So a lot of them are like, oh, we don't know how to do it. I'm like, you? And we let you run an entire country's education system? Problematic. Okay? For new students that come in 2017, then you obviously implement the new rules going forward. So that's a prospective one. So you need to deal with the people already in the system, and then thereafter focus on the people that are coming into the system. So this is the solutions matrix that we came up with. One of them said, oh, what if everybody then wants to go to UCT? I'm like, no. UCT still has the responsibility of determining the access points. So they need to deal with the academic issues and all of that. It's not our issue to deal with. However, because we are advocating that the rich should not be stealing places at the expense of the poor, we actually recommend that you look at the UCT admissions policy and the Wits University's medical school's own admission policy, which says actually we cannot have a system that's been captured by rich people only. Access must be equitable across the system, and this is how we do it, okay? So we've built that into the conversation, okay? Enrollment plans are the responsibility of universities. We're not going to interfere with that. So we've put all this in this document. We've made it publicly available. Obviously, I think Dave is busy sharpening something, so he hasn't met up with us, and we don't have the mandate to meet him anyway, okay? So how do we then do the collection on the other hand, okay? So what happens here is that once people graduate, we're then saying that the corporates should actually pay what we call a corporate graduate levy, okay? So that levy is paid by the corporate on behalf of the student. It already happens with the skills development levy, but then that gets stolen by other elements of corruption in the system, okay? So what we're saying about this one is that it must come directly to the university system, okay? It's similar to what you might call a UIF model, but a UIF is a cost to the employee. We want this to be a cost to the employer. So that's why we're calling it the levy, because when the employer pays, it's called a levy. When the employee pays, it's called something else. It's very funny how they do these things, okay? So what that will do is that it will then give us enough funding to be plowed back into this fund. And this fund will then be in a position to fund as many students that are at university as possible. The difference between this fund and any other fund that exists, in other words, NSFAS, is that NSFAS is actually worse than SAA. SAA occasionally asks for a bailout, depending on what Dudubeni decides to do. NSFAS is actually being permanently bailed out because it's not designed to be solvent on its own. So somewhere along the line, somebody will come back to us and say, but you guys are always asking for bailouts. This year, the bailout was 17 billion Rand. Next year, that bailout will be around 20 billion Rand if the system remains. So before we complain about SAA, we must understand that NSFAS is actually an even worse model as well. We don't think that model should exist because we found a way that actually doesn't require South Africans to actually make sacrifices. We are going to make the sacrifices on our behalf. We're going to fund ourselves, and this is how we want to do it, okay? So right now, these are the current tax rates in South Africa. So if we need to raise money just to create the funding for a start into this particular fund, we've given them the new tax rates. See, we've done the job for them. These are the numbers that need to be changed, and this is how much money you're going to raise, okay? So this is available to the government. If anyone has seen them of late, please let them know. Yeah, the president is missing in action, as usual. Okay, so these are the permutations that are available there, right? How do we do it? So we then say to them, okay, if you had to do a calculations exercise to then work out where the money goes, let us look at next year's intake, okay? Because the people within the system, we need to obviously fund them until they exit. But since we are looking at a prospective model, next year's intake will look like this, okay? So currently, the system is made up of 17% of people who pursue certificates, 33% diplomas, 30% 3 degrees and 4 degrees. So that is the split currently in the system. So if we introduce 100,000 students into the system, this is essentially where they'd be allocated, okay? If you look at the average tuition fees, for now, it's 40,000 Rand. We understand that things go up, so we're happy to inflate it every year by 8%, not the 10.5% that VETS always comes up with, not the 13% that UCT likes, okay? Full cost of study is 80,000 Rand. So that's our starting point, and this is what it looks like, okay? If we have 100,000 students that enter the system next year, okay, participation rates simply say that from a particular group, how many of them actually come into university. So obviously, the students from the poorest schools, because they hardly have any teachers to begin with, then they only have a participation rate of 10%. But now we want to not only guarantee that participation rate, but also increase it over the next 5 years, okay? As you can see, people above 600,000 Rand, according to the minister, they make up 30% of the population. It is our intention to decrease their influence in the system because it's incorrect that the rich buy their way into the system at the expense of the poor. So we're even saying, look, if all you could do in the budget statement on Wednesday is come and say, guys, tuition fees will be paid for everyone, the answer is still only 4 billion Rand. That's less than what you just paid to bail out SAA. How difficult can this be? Okay? If you then decided that you're going to pay for full cost of study, by all means, thank you, it's only going to cost you 8 billion Rand. That's still affordable. A couple of years ago, you guys may not be aware of this because it was well hidden. National Treasury went on this initiative of trying to save money. So what they did was that they created what they call a contingency reserve fund. And that contingency fund had around 64 billion Rand, okay? So it was money that was there in case there was a crisis. Unfortunately, National Treasury reported to Parliament that they've got this reserve. So what then happened, and this is a great scandal, what then happened was that then the unions or somebody else then went to the president and said, actually, we need you to increase public servant salaries by 10% when inflation was 6%. So as soon as the government heard that there was 60 billion Rand available in National Treasury, he agreed to a 10% increase for civil servants. And that 60 billion Rand disappeared overnight. So the money is not unavailable. It's a matter of what you do with it. Okay? So this is why the teachers and the police haven't gone on a wage strike in the past couple of years, because the president took 60 billion and said, I can shut you guys up for the next 4 years. He did it. Now we're asking him to do the same. Okay? So in this model, option one, this is what it looks like for the technocrats, because we're then saying to them, okay, fine. If you go for option one, this is how much it's going to cost you. Okay? So for the students in the first two groups, you'd have to pay 1 billion Rand to cover their tuition. For the students in the third group, it costs 800 million. So the total cost of 4 billion Rand can be split into this way. Okay? So if you say to me, I'm happy to pay every single cent for every student up to 300,000 Rand, it will mean that the state is then covering the 400 and the 600 million, which is 1 billion. And then for the middle class students, they cover 425 million people. We're still saying, look, it's only 36% that you have to pay. And people can still come up with 64%. We're not being unreasonable. I think you need to get that very clear. We're not being unreasonable. This is a starting point. We're making it accessible and affordable for the state. Okay? If you then decided that you wanted to pay the full cost of the students using our sliding scale system, you still only have to commit to 3 billion Rand as it were. This can be done. The money is not missing. It is there. Okay? So that's in the first option. In the second option, this is how much it would cost the state. Okay? So they'd have to pay 2.7 billion Rand if they go for option 2, just for tuition only. If they pay for the full cost, it's only 4 billion Rand that they need to contribute into the system. Okay? But that's not the greatest part of our model, guys. The greatest part of this model is that we are happy to say to the government, you don't actually have to pay. We'll actually be able to raise that 4 billion rand on our own through our new model. So you don't actually have to commit to paying this for the next 20 years. All we need from you is a commitment to say, in the initial rollout period, we will fund this particular structure until it starts paying itself off. The interesting thing about government solution called NSFAS is that NSFAS has a 15-year collection period. Okay? So NSFAS is allowed to chase you down for 15 years and keep telling you that you must pay back. Okay? So at the end of the 15th year, NSFAS is officially allowed to give up and stop chasing you. Okay? So that's the legal reality of it. They've got a 15-year collection period. Sometimes NSFAS forgets to do simple things though, so they don't collect properly. Okay? The difference between ours and their model is that their model is firstly a permanent cost to the state. It requires an annual bailout, and then it will chase you down for 15 years. Our model will actually start paying for itself after 7 years. So at the end of the 7th year, we've worked out that the contribution that come into this pot will match the cost of funding students within the pot. So from the 7th year onwards, we wouldn't actually have to go back to the government and ask for you to fund universities. But they refuse to listen. So that's the type of structure that's been created for them, but they're too busy fighting each other in order to be able to deal with this. So we've created the numbers here. As you can see, whichever model that they choose, we've got an answer to say this is the cost. If nothing else, all they can do is come back to us and say, okay, you've said the cost is 18 billion rand, we only have 16 billion rand, let's talk. You know, we're having a conversation, guys. We're not fighting anyone, we're having a conversation. Give me a number, then I can come back to my constituency and say, guys, this is what they've given us on the table, this is what we can do with it. And that's all we've been asking for 12 months. How difficult can this be? Okay? So that is really what the mechanics of the model is. If anyone, as I said, if anyone has seen the president of late, please tell him that this is available for his consumption. It's not a lot of slides. I think you can manage to read through it. It's only 50 pages, but we're happy to explain it to him as well. So we think that with such an approach, we have created a very tangible roadmap of what it will take to actually create free education in South Africa. And when we say to you that it's a 7-year timeline, we've been very conservative. We're saying, well, actually, if the government really doesn't want to participate and only does the barest minimum, it will take us 7 years. If they come back to us and say, actually, we're willing to give a bit more, this thing could be self-sustaining within 5 years. So free education is a reality within the short term. But right now, we are stuck. Thank you for your time.